Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to our weekly explained session. The topic for today would be the G7 and its agenda. In this session, we shall talk about the G7 and its members. We shall discuss the history and the background to this grouping. We shall also understand the significance of G7 in global affairs. We shall also be talking about the latest developments related to G7 and India's equation with this grouping. But before that, let's begin by understanding as to why this topic is in news. We need to understand why the G7 is relevant for our exams. See, last week, that is between the 11th of June and the 13th of June, the 47th summit of the G7 was held in the United Kingdom. I'm sure you would have read about this in newspapers, right? The UK hosted the 47th summit of the G7. During this summit level interaction, the prime ministers and the presidents of the G7 group, they met, they interacted, they discussed several important global issues, and they even announced several important initiatives. See, for this year, the presidency of the G7 is held by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the host of the G7 and it holds the presidency for this year. So UK had invited India as well as a guest country to participate in this summit. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi participated in the G7 summit, virtually of course, and he contributed to the discussions of the G7. This is what makes the topic very important for our exams, that is for both prelims and mains. So let's begin our discussion by talking about what is the G7, what is this grouping. Let's understand which countries are a part of it. Let's look at its history, its background, its achievements, and discuss any criticism that exists against this group. Okay? The G7, as the name itself indicates, it's a group of 7 countries. It includes the world's 7 largest IMF advanced economies. These countries, they are Western developed countries, these are wealthy nations, and they are also liberal democracies. So politically and economically, these 7 countries, they have a lot of alignment. They concur on most of the global issues. This is essentially an intergovernmental platform, a political economic forum, where the 7 most advanced countries or industrialized nations, as per the IMF, they get together to discuss some of the pressing global economic challenges and geopolitical issues. The members of G7 include the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United States. These are the 7 countries which are members of the G7. This could be a potential prelims question. However, the European Union also gets a regular representation at the G7. Please remember, the EU is not a member of the G7. But however, the EU is given annual representation at the G7 summit. Officials and representatives of the European Union, including the President of the European Commission, they get a representation every year. They participate in the G7 summit. But this does not make the European Union a member of the G7. So only these 7 countries that you can see over here, only they are a part of the G7 grouping. This group was established back in 1975. That's when it was formally constituted. And this grouping is very significant in today's global economy and global affairs, because these countries, they account for 40% of the global GDP and they constitute around 1/10 of the world's population. This is what makes the G7 so important with regard to the global economy, with regard to geopolitics, strategic issues, education, healthcare, environment and climate change, and even global healthcare. On all these important issues, the G7 acquires a lot of significance because it consists of the 7 most advanced and developed economies. Is that clear? So now that you know what is the G7, let's talk about the background. Let's understand how this grouping was formed, what were the contributing factors which led these countries to form the G7. To understand this, we need to go back to the 1970s. See, the 1970s was a period of volatility and turmoil in the global economy. There were two important developments that took place in the early 1970s which pushed the global economy into a financial crisis. One was the collapse of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system in 1971, and the other was the 1973 oil crisis. These two shock events disrupted the global economy, pushed the global economy into a financial crisis. This of course affected the developed countries, that is US, Japan, Italy, UK and the others, and it created a ground for these economies to get together and form a platform to deal with global economic challenges. I am sure you would have heard about the Bretton Woods system. After the Second World War ended, right, the global financial system was defined through the Bretton Woods Conference, which gave birth to two institutions, that is the World Bank and the IMF. These institutions, which were set up through the Bretton Woods Conference, they are known as the Bretton Woods institutions. They provided a framework for the global economy, for the global financial system to function. Under this system, in order to promote free trade, a fixed exchange rate system was introduced. All the major currencies of the world, right, like the sterling, the Japanese currency and all the major currencies, they were asked to become fully convertible so that free trade could be carried out. They were made fully convertible in both the capital account and the current account, and these major currencies, they were pegged to the US dollar, which was set up as the primary reserve currency, and the US dollar in turn was pegged to the gold reserves of the United States. Back then, the gold was a standard for fixing the exchange rate, for fixing the currency rates. So as a result of this system, this fixed exchange rate system, which was linked to the US dollar and US gold reserves, there was a detrimental impact on the other countries. Because when you have a fixed exchange rate system, when your currencies are interlinked, the monetary policies of these countries were also interlinked. So the policies of the US government and the policies of the US Federal Reserve was affecting the policies of other countries. See, in the late 1960s, inflation started to shoot up in the United States. This excess inflation in the US started spilling over into the other economies as well because of the fixed exchange rate system, because their monetary policies were inherently interlinked. And eventually, the US was running out of gold reserves. In the 1970s, its gold reserves started declining, thereby affecting the exchange rate system. So due to all these complexities, the other economies decided to quit the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system. It came to an end in 1971, and it also marked the end of gold as a reserve currency. From then, gold was not used as a reserve currency and the world moved towards the dollar-based system. So when these countries, when they quit the fixed exchange rate system, it disrupted the global economy, it affected free trade, the free movement of goods was affected, and as a result, there was an economic impact. The global economy was affected. The developed countries in particular, the US and the West European countries, they were affected. Then within a couple of years, a major oil crisis emerged in the Middle East. This 1973 oil crisis was related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. What happened was in 1973, the Arab countries went to war with Israel, and this conflict is known as the Yom Kippur War. In this conflict, the Western countries, they extended support to Israel. When this conflict broke out between Arab countries and Israel, countries like US, Japan, France, Canada, they all extended open support to Israel. So this angered the Arab countries, and they called for an oil blockade or an oil embargo on the Western nations which were supporting Israel. The Middle Eastern countries, which are the major petroleum exporting countries, led by Saudi Arabia, they called for an oil blockade. They blocked oil supplies to those Western countries which were supporting Israel during the 1973 war. So this led to a major oil crisis because the supply of oil was disrupted. The supply of oil to the Western economies, to the developed economies, was disrupted from the Middle East. So as a result, their economic growth was compromised. Their economic activities were disrupted. So due to these shock events, the global economy slipped into a financial crisis in the early 1970s. This created a need for these countries to come together and create a common platform where they could deal with such economic shocks and economic challenges. First, it was the finance ministers of France and US who met and who envisioned such a platform where the developed countries could get together and discuss the economic issues. So this meeting between the finance ministers eventually led to the foundation of the G7 in 1975. From 1975 onwards, the respective heads of state and heads of government, that is the prime ministers and the presidents of these countries, they started interacting with each other regularly from 1975. When this forum was formed, initially it was just the G6. I want you to remember this. Initially in 1975, when the grouping was created, it was just the G6. Canada was still not a member of this group. It was only in the following year, in 1976, that Canada was also brought on board, as it was the 7th largest economy back in 1976. So initially, the 6 other countries, they formed the G6, a summit level interaction was held, and from here onwards, they made it an annual summit. So every year from 1975, the heads of state and government of these countries, they would meet and discuss all major economic challenges that were facing the world. Next year in 1976, Canada was also included, and thus the G6 became the G7 or the group of 7. Okay? And in 1977, the European Economic Community was also invited to take part in the interaction of the G7. The European Economic Community was the predecessor of the European Union. The European Union was formed much later in 1993. But before that, the predecessor of EU was the European Economic Community. So this economic community was invited by the G7 to represent the European region. So from late 1970s, the European region also became a permanent representation at the G7. But like I said earlier, the European Economic Community and later the EU, they are not members of the G7. Is that clear? They don't hold membership. They just participate every year in the annual summit. So like this, the G7 was formed, and throughout 1970s, it kept on dealing with major economic challenges that were facing the world. The global economy had entered into a recession because of the oil crisis and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system with regard to exchange rates. The G7 played a key role in reviving the global economy and in correcting the disruption that had been caused in the oil markets. So the G7 became quite successful with this, and slowly the G7 became more ambitious. Because see, now we not only had the largest economies under one block, these countries, they also shared a lot of ideological similarities. They were all liberal democracies, wealthy, developed, industrialized nations. So even strategically and geopolitically, their thought, their approach was converging. They had a lot of mutual interests and mutual concerns. So once they succeeded in stabilizing the global economy, the G7 expanded its mandate. So throughout 1980s, we saw that the G7 was also dealing with several foreign policy and security related issues as well. For example, the Iran-Iraq war, it had broken out in 1980s, lasted for 8 years between 1980 and 88. It was destabilizing the Middle East region, disrupting global oil markets. So the G7 intervened and it tried to resolve the Iran-Iraq conflict. Then it also took note of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which began in 1979. The Soviets occupied Afghanistan until 1989. So for 1 decade, the Soviet Union was in occupation of Afghanistan, and the G7 countries were looking into this issue. Because remember, this was the era of the Cold War. There was a huge ideological divide between the democratic bloc led by US and West European countries and the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan for almost a decade, many of the G7 countries were playing a role in throwing out the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. The United States and few other countries, they backed a covert war against the Soviet occupying forces by sponsoring the Afghan Mujahideen as a resistance against the Soviet Union. So like this, the G7 became a platform to discuss even foreign policy, geopolitical and security related issues. It was slowly turning into a strategic platform. Then in 1980s, that is in late 1980s and early 1990s, the world order changed drastically. The Cold War came to an end, right? Germany was reunified. The Cold War divide ended in Europe. West and East Europe was coming together. And more importantly, the Soviet Union, the ideological rival of the United States, had collapsed. It had disintegrated. So the successor state of the Soviet Union, that is Russia, was then invited to take part in the interactions and the meetings of the G7. For a few years, Russia was just invited as a guest country, but in 1998, Russia was formally included into this group, and thus the G7 became the G8. Is that clear? Now, the G7 had evolved again, and its membership had been expanded to include Russia as well. So Russia would continue to be a member of this group, and this group would be known as the G8 until 2014. For several years, Russia was taking part in this summit, and it was the G8, not the G7. But in 2014, there were few developments which led to a divide again between Russia and the United States. What happened was, Russia annexed Crimea in violation of international law. It also started meddling in Ukraine, and it was held responsible for the civil war in Ukraine by the Western countries. So by 2014, a new rivalry was emerging between US and Russia. There was increasing hostility between them. So the US started acting against Russia. It retaliated against Russia for its annexation of Crimea and for its interference in Ukraine. So as a result, the G7 decided to boycott Russia, and in 2014, Russia was formally removed from the grouping. So now the G8 came back to being the G7. Is that clear? So for a short period, Russia was a member of the group became the G8, but it was removed from the grouping because of these developments in 2014. Since then, the group has remained the G7. Okay, this is about the history of this grouping and the way in which it has evolved. Now, let's talk about some of the important achievements and initiatives that have been taken up by the G7. This will help you understand why the G7 is a significant grouping in global affairs. See, as we discussed, the G7 has successfully dealt with many global economic and financial challenges. It has also dealt with many strategic and security related issues, especially in the 1980s. But from the 1990s onwards, the G7 has really diversified its mandate. It is no longer restricted to economic issues and strategic issues. It has diversified its mandate, and it is dealing with almost all major global challenges. From late 1990s, especially from the 21st century, from early 2000, the G7 has dealt with counterterrorism, it has dealt with education, healthcare, development, climate change and environment protection. So all these issues are being covered by the G7 today. In 1997, the G7 set up a fund to help out Ukraine to deal with the impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which had taken place in 1986. Right? Ukraine on its own was not able to deal with the impact of the Chernobyl disaster. The G7 tried to help out, and it set up a dedicated fund to contain the impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Then at the turn of the century, in 1999, the G7 started taking note of the emerging economies. The emerging economies of the developing world like India, China and other Asian powers, they started receiving more prominence from the G7 because right now the Asian economies, the Asian powers, they were rising, they were exploding. And parallelly in Europe, the European economies were on the decline. The G7 recognized this landmark shift which was happening in global economy and in global geopolitics, and they started stepping up their interaction with the developing world as well. Their focus was the emerging economies, especially the Asian economies, and G7 even played a role in the establishment of the G20. The G20 is the group of 20 which was set up in 1999. This is also an economic financial grouping, and it consists of 20 of the largest economies of the world. It of course includes the G7 members and the next 13 largest economies. So G20 consists of countries like India, it also consists of Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, China. So many such developing emerging economies are also part of G20, and G7 started paying more attention to them. As these economies were growing, the G7 even tried to provide financial aid and development assistance to developing countries, especially to middle income and low income countries. The G7 was doing this to remain relevant, to retain its influence and to maintain good relations with the developing world. Is that clear? Then in 2002, the G7 further expanded its mandate and started looking at global health challenges. This is one of the biggest achievements of the G7, and you need to take note of this. In 2002, the G7 set up a global fund to fight malaria, tuberculosis and AIDS. Because of this funding initiative, millions of lives have been saved in the world. This funding mechanism was meant for smaller countries, low income and middle income countries. The G7 countries, they pooled their resources, financed this global fund, which has helped in the fight against these deadly diseases. Okay? And of late, the G7 countries have also started focusing on climate change and climate financing. These industrialized countries, they finally acknowledged their historical responsibilities with regard to global warming. These countries could become developed in the first place because they freely burnt fossil fuels for decades together, for almost a couple of centuries, which allowed them to become developed in the first place. Right? So they have already exhausted their carbon budget. So this restricts the options or the space available for smaller countries to develop their economy, to provide for socio-economic development. So finally the G7, under the pressure of the other countries, it started taking note of their historical responsibilities. It started acknowledging the historical emissions that were released by the G7 countries, which essentially contributed to climate change and global warming in the first place. So by taking note of this historical responsibility, the G7 countries, they started arranging financing, they started arranging funding to the developing nations so that they could mitigate the impact of climate change. Is that clear? In 2015, it even supported the Global Apollo program, which is providing financing for clean energy research and development projects in developing nations. The Global Apollo program is helping the smaller countries to invest in research and development for clean energy alternatives. So the G7 members are sponsoring such programs, and as you can see, today the mandate of G7 has really expanded. Initially it started out by focusing only on economic challenges. Later it took up strategic issues, foreign policy issues. Today it has expanded and diversified its mandate to deal with global healthcare, climate change, education, healthcare, etc. This is what makes the G7 a significant grouping. It's a very important and a very influential grouping. But however, this grouping has also come in for heavy criticism. Many countries from the developing world, including India, have often criticized the G7. You need to know what criticism exists against the G7. See, as you saw, the G7 is basically an elite club. It's an exclusive club which is limited to 7 most developed industrialized nations. So this limited membership of the grouping and its narrow global representation makes this an elite exclusive club. In many ways, it is similar to the UN Security Council, which has become an elite club only for the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members. The problem for developing countries is that this small group of countries, these 7 countries, are getting to decide on global economic issues, and their decisions and their actions is having a disproportionate impact on the global economy. Whatever the G7 decides will have a significant impact on the global economy, and the other countries don't get to have a say in this, right? Because this grouping is exclusive, it's an elite club. That is why countries like India and many other smaller developing nations, they once in a while criticize the G7 as well because of its outdated mandate. Because all these are Cold War era institutions, just like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. We often say that these multilateral platforms, they have become outdated. They don't represent today's geopolitical realities. They don't recognize the new countries which have emerged. They don't give space for new powers which have emerged, right? And whatever decisions the small group of countries take, it will have a disproportionate impact on the entire world. So this is one of the biggest criticisms against the G7. Then apart from this, the G7 is also criticized for being ineffective. In several instances, the G7 has failed to prevent a crisis situation, or it has failed to contain a crisis situation. For example, look at the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It was triggered by the housing market bubble in the United States. It's also known as the subprime crisis, and it pushed the global economy into a recession. Then in the 1990s as well, there was a major economic crisis in the Asian economies. Then post 2009, there was a crisis in the Eurozone. The Eurozone countries went into a financial crisis, and G7 was pretty much ineffective in preventing these crisis situations. Forget preventing, it even failed in containing the situation and in providing a decent solution for these challenges. So for all these reasons, the critics of G7, they point out that this grouping is largely ineffective. It proclaims to have a lot of significance, but in reality, it is said to be ineffective by a few experts and critics. So if you understand this background, if you know this history and this evolution of G7, right, you will be able to answer any related mains questions. In mains, you can definitely expect a question on these lines. UPSC might ask you to talk about the history of G7. Why is it significant, right? And what has been its contribution, or what is the biggest criticism against G7? So such a critical question or analysis based question can come, and you need to be prepared for that. So now let's come to the latest developments. Let's talk about the recent summit of the G7 that took place in the United Kingdom. The UK hosted the 47th summit of the G7. It was held at the Carbis Bay Hotel in Cornwall. Cornwall is a very scenic and a very picturesque beach location in the UK. There at a luxury resort known as Carbis Bay Hotel, that's where the G7 summit was held, right? It was held between the 11th of June to the 13th of June. This summit received a lot of media coverage around the world as well as in India, because in this summit, several important initiatives have been taken up. The G7 has announced many important initiatives, and they are going to be very important for your exams. So let's start by looking at the Carbis Bay Health Declaration, which was adopted by the G7. Okay, this was the initiative taken by G7 with regard to global healthcare. Because see, this summit, the 47th summit, it was held under the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, last year's summit, the 2020 summit, it was supposed to be hosted by the US. But last year's summit was cancelled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the travel restrictions, the summit could not take place. This was the first time that a G7 summit had ever been cancelled. Before this, a G7 summit had never been cancelled. So the last summit had taken place only in 2019. It had been almost 2 years since these countries had met under the G7. So this is what makes the 47th summit so special. The UK was hosting the summit. It holds the presidency for this year, and this summit was being arranged and held under the shadow of the pandemic. As you know, the pandemic has disrupted our lives. More than 3 million people have lost their lives around the world. It has disrupted economic activities, right? The lockdown and the pandemic, it has disrupted lives around the world. It has affected economic growth and activities. So as a result, the topmost priority for the G7 was to look at the pandemic situation and come out with solutions which can help the world contain the pandemic as soon as possible. Plus, the G7 was also looking at reviving economic growth around the world, which has been disrupted by the pandemic and the lockdowns. So in this regard, the G7 members have adopted the Carbis Bay Health Declaration. Please remember, the name can be important for prelims and even for mains. Let's see what this declaration talks about. Under this declaration, there are two main provisions. One is cooperative and collaborative solutions to end the pandemic as soon as possible, and the other is to prevent any such future pandemics. These are the two focus areas of the Carbis Bay Health Declaration. Under this declaration, the G7 countries have pledged to support the other countries, especially the developing countries, by providing 1 billion doses of vaccines to the low and middle income countries. In the Western world, the vaccination rate has really increased. They're already seeing a reduction in the number of cases, plus they have a excess stockpile of vaccines with them. So they're looking to provide these excess doses that they already have and supply them to low and middle income countries to help them contain the pandemic. Because this pandemic and the vaccination drive around the world, it has exposed vaccine inequity. Many countries, including India, they are struggling to procure the required doses to vaccinate their population. Whereas Western countries have gone ahead because they had pre-ordered these doses and they have a huge stockpile of vaccine sitting with them. So they are looking to help out the smaller developing countries and even other low and middle income nations by supplying vaccines to them, and the G7 has pledged to provide for 1 billion doses of vaccines in the near future. Next, these countries will also support and even finance two important initiatives that has been backed by the UN. One is Act A and the other is the COVAX facility. See, Act A stands for Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This initiative was set up last year with the backing of the World Health Organization and the United Nations. It has even been backed by several other charitable institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So several global institutions have come together to support the Act A initiative, under which the smaller countries in particular are being helped out with regard to diagnostic tools, with regard to treatment, and as well as with regard to vaccine production and vaccine supplies. So this initiative is led by the WHO and backed by the UN. So under the Act A initiative, there is something known as the COVAX facility. This facility is meant for developing vaccines for COVID-19, producing them, and as well as for distributing them around the world by ensuring vaccine equity. This is the objective of COVAX facility. It comes under the Act A initiative itself. It's one of the pillars of the Act A initiative. These initiatives have been supported by several governments, including the Indian government, right? And of course, the G7 members, they have been backing the Act A initiative and the COVAX facility. For example, India has supplied vaccines to the COVAX facility, right? Then even institutions like Gavi, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, even they are backing and supporting these initiatives. So the G7 countries have committed to provide any surplus stocks they have or any excess supplies they have, and even arrange for extra financing to these initiatives. This is designed to help the smaller countries to contain the pandemic as soon as possible. Okay? Then apart from that, they have promised to reduce the roadblocks that exist for vaccine raw material exports. As you might know, India is one of the largest producers of vaccines in the world. But our vaccine production was hit very badly for a few months because of the unavailability of raw materials. Most of these raw materials, they come from US and other European countries. Because of the pandemic situation, those countries had restricted these exports, and it was affecting vaccine production in countries like India. So India appealed to countries like US and other countries to relax these restrictions, to remove these export roadblocks, so that raw materials can be easily imported into India and we could quickly produce, vaccines on a large scale. So this demand of countries like India has been met. G7 countries have started taking steps to erase these roadblocks and ensure that vaccine raw materials are provided on time to major producing countries like India. This is one of the important decisions that has been taken. Next, the G7 has also agreed to discuss and consider the proposal of India and South Africa, which was made at the WTO. Last year, India and South Africa, they jointly sponsored a resolution at the WTO seeking a waiver of patents under the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement of the WTO, it regulates the intellectual property regime, the IPR regime. So India, South Africa requested the WTO and the member countries to waive off patents temporarily so that patented vaccines could be produced in developing countries as well. This was supposed to help scale up the production of vaccines and contain the pandemic quickly. So this has been a long-standing demand of India and South Africa from the last few months. Many developed countries have expressed support, and at the G7, they have stated that they will consider this matter, take it forward, hold further negotiations, and see what they can do at the WTO. They still haven't agreed to support it completely, but they've agreed to hold the discussions and consider whether a temporary waiver of patents can be given for certain vaccines, which will help in containing the pandemic. Okay, this is another major development. Next, finally, to prevent such pandemics in the future, to prevent such infectious diseases from spreading around the world, the G7 has taken a major step to set up a new health surveillance system. Under this, the G7 is looking to set up a global watchdog which could monitor the emergence of such diseases and quickly respond to these incidents and contain the spread of the disease. Is that clear? A global watchdog will come up under the G7. It will provide for a much more efficient surveillance mechanism. It will be given the powers to conduct inspections in other countries to monitor the spread and the breakout of new diseases. This was missing in the case of COVID-19 pandemic. The WHO was found to be ineffective, and China was not transparent about the data that it was sharing, and it was directly responsible for the massive spread of the disease. So to prevent this from happening in the future, a new global watchdog would be created under this health surveillance system, which will have the powers to conduct inspections in other countries as well. Okay? And to respond quickly to future pandemic threats, a 100-day mission has been laid down under the G7. This is based on the principle of prevent, detect, and respond. Based on this principle, the G7 has come out with a 100-day mission for itself. If in the future any pandemic breaks out, or if any infectious disease starts spreading quickly, then immediately the G7 countries will respond to it. First, they will try to prevent its spread. They will detect the spread of the epidemic and respond in a timely manner to ensure that the spread is contained. So they have given themselves a target of 100 days to develop all the tools that are required to combat such diseases. Be it surveillance mechanism, be it diagnostics, be it treatment, and even development and production of vaccines. All of this should happen within the first 100 days. So this gives us the best chance to contain any such future pandemics. These are some of the major health related initiatives that have been announced at the G7 summit. Okay? Now, if this is clear, let's talk about some other important initiatives that the G7 has taken up. The G7 has proposed a very important global financial reform. The G7 countries have agreed to adopt a global minimum corporate tax. See, right now, governments around the world are struggling with their finances. They're not getting enough revenue because economic activities have slowed down. Economic growth has been curtailed because of the lockdowns. So government revenue has been affected. And parallelly, government expenditure has gone up significantly. They are supposed to spend more on healthcare. Their expenditure on containing the pandemic has gone up. Right? Overall, their socio-economic welfare expenditure has increased significantly. So at this time, governments are struggling to raise revenue, and as it happens, large corporates, large companies, multinational corporations, they are found to be evading taxes. They evade paying higher taxes in certain countries by shifting their jurisdiction or by shifting their profits to low tax jurisdictions and tax havens. There are few low tax jurisdictions in the world. There are few tax havens in the world. For example, we have Mauritius and Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. In the Caribbean region, we have many small island nations like British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands. They've all declared themselves as low tax jurisdictions or as tax havens. You also have Panama in Central America. Then you have Ireland in Europe. So all these low tax jurisdictions and tax havens, they attract all private corporate investments. Is that clear? If companies are registered over here, they will show their profits in this country and they will evade paying higher taxes in other countries, in other jurisdictions where they would have actually generated these profits. Now let's say, for example, there is a large MNC operating in India. Its business in India has generated millions of dollars in profit. If they report these profits here in India, they will have to pay a higher percentage of taxes to the Indian government. To avoid that, what they do is the company would be registered in one of these tax havens or in one of these low tax jurisdictions. They will shift their profits to these tax havens, and since double taxation is not imposed, they will shift their tax burden out of India and into these low tax jurisdictions or into these tax havens. So they avoid paying higher taxes to the Indian government, even though the profit was generated here in India, even though this profit was generated through their business operations conducted in India. So this is a global problem. It happens around the world. In countries like India, the corporate tax on average is somewhere around 21% if you take all the corporate taxes into account. If you include other surcharge, cess and the others, the effective taxes that private companies are paying in India is somewhere around 25%. I'm just giving a rough estimate. In other Asian countries like China, Malaysia, then Singapore and Japan, right? In all these Asian economies, the corporate tax is in the range of 24% to 29%. Even in the developed world, in West Europe, in US, corporate taxes are pretty high. They're usually about 20%. But in the low tax jurisdictions, the taxes can be lower than 5%. Sometimes it can be nil. So this basically creates a competition amongst the countries. Any country which has the lowest tax, they will attract all the investments. All the companies will rush to that country, register their companies over there, and that will bring more investments to those countries. So this is basically a rush to the bottom. It is a never-ending competition between the global economies where they are trying to undercut each other. They are trying to reduce the tax burden on the corporate sector so that they can attract more investments. When this happens, the tax havens, low tax jurisdictions, which are usually small countries, small island states, they benefit. It helps in their economic growth, in their economic activities. But however, it results in loss of revenue for larger countries like India, US and the others. We can't afford to cut taxes to such levels because we have to spend on welfare. We are a very large country with socio-economic obligations. To fund these welfare programs, the government needs revenue, right? We can't afford such low taxes on corporates. So when there are these small countries, jurisdictions giving these low tax benefits, right, it triggers a race to the bottom and all investments will rush over there, thus depriving other large countries of their due revenue. That is why the US took the initiative under President Biden, and as soon as he came to power, he proposed a radical taxation reform. He proposed a global minimum corporate tax. It will be like a threshold, a minimum cap will be set, countries around the world will have to follow that. This is through mutual agreement and no country can impose taxes below this. Once they follow this, once they accept these conditions, the taxes they impose on corporates should be above the minimum tax rate that they have agreed upon. The US had proposed a minimum tax rate of 21%, but following negotiations at the G7 countries have agreed for a minimum threshold of 15%. Okay, this is the final agreement. They have agreed for a 15% minimum corporate tax. So when this threshold is set, right, it will end that competition which was taking place before and it will bring more revenue to all the governments. But however, implementing this policy will face several challenges, because see, this is a decision of the G7 countries. It's not an obligation on the others. Other countries can't be forced to accept this. And also note that smaller countries, they are actually using this as a policy tool. It's a policy tool for them to develop their economy. For small countries like Mauritius, they don't have much of economic resources, right? Mauritius is heavily dependent on sugarcane and fishing and tourism. So all these smaller countries which are tax havens and low tax jurisdictions, they are heavily dependent on the investments that they are getting. So they are using their tax policy as a tool, as a sovereign right to provide these low tax benefits so that they can sustain their economy. Obviously, these countries can't be forced to accept the minimum threshold given by G7, right? Even for India, accepting this is not an obligation. But however, for the mutual benefit, countries might accept this following their negotiations with the developed world, with the developed countries. For India, this minimum tax will be helpful because right now our minimum corporate tax stands at around 21%, right? And if you include other surcharge and taxes, it goes up to 25%. So we still have a lot of room, a lot of space to continue with this policy, and if it is implemented around the world, it will bring more revenue to other countries as well, especially to large governments, to large countries. But in implementing, there will be many challenges. It may not be accepted by every country because they will feel that their sovereign right over their taxation policy is getting violated. For them, this is an escape route out of economic deprivation. They are using this as a policy tool to promote their economy, right? So those countries may not agree to this. Then even if this proposal is implemented around the world, even then corporates might still evade taxes by employing money laundering techniques. It's not that it's a guarantee that tax evasion will come to an end. Yes, the tax revenue, tax collection will go up if it is widely accepted, but tax evasion through other forms, through illegal methods like money laundering will continue. That can't be prevented through a minimum corporate tax. Okay, but however, this is a paradigm shift in global taxation. It's a major reform that the G7 has accepted, and we need to see how things will proceed from here onwards. So this was about the G7 initiative with regard to the global economy. Next, during this summit, the G7 members also focused upon climate change and global warming. They have reiterated their commitment to fulfill the targets that have been laid out under the Paris Agreement to the Climate Change Convention. Okay? See, under the Climate Change Convention, the developed countries had pledged a fund of $100 billion every year as a part of their historical responsibilities. Under the climate change negotiations, developed countries had accepted their historical emissions, their historical responsibilities, and they had promised to set up $100 billion fund every single year to finance climate change initiatives in small developing nations. But this fund was never effectively implemented, right? Few countries contributed, but many others like US, they never made a full contribution. So the fund which was promised never came into being, it was never effective. So now the G7 has renewed this pledge to ensure that every year $100 billion in funding would be arranged for the coming few years to help out the smaller countries, the poor countries and the developing nations to deal with climate change and global warming. They can use the fund to invest in cleaner forms of energy. They can use the funds to mitigate the impact of climate change and natural disasters. So that's a very important decision. Next, the G7 has decided to phase out coal-based power plants in their respective countries. This is also a very, very important decision. They are looking to phase out all coal-based power plants within their countries. They are also planning to end the funding of new coal-based power plants in other countries. Countries like Canada, US and France, they are known to fund energy projects in smaller countries and they usually fund coal-based energy projects as well. But since they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, the G7 has decided to phase out all coal-based power plants in their own countries and also to stop funding new coal-based power plants in the other countries. So this is again a very important decision. They have also decided to offer $2.8 billion to developing countries so that they can switch to cleaner forms of energy like solar energy, hydropower, nuclear, etc. Right? Around $2.8 billion in funding would be provided by the G7. It will be available to the developing nations and they can use it to switch towards cleaner and renewable forms of energy. They have also taken commitments to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and they have also reiterated their commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the middle of this century. These targets are very, very important to achieve the targets of Paris Agreement, that is to keep global temperatures from rising and keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. Is that clear? These are some of the important climate change related initiatives that the G7 has announced. Then even with regard to infrastructure and connectivity, the G7 has announced a very important initiative. Led by the US, the G7 has announced the Build Back Better World Partnership or the B3W. Strategic experts are pointing out that this could be a counter of the US to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I am sure you would have heard about China's One Belt, One Road project or the Belt and Road Initiative of China. This is a very ambitious connectivity project that China is funding. China is investing more than $1 trillion in Asia, Africa and Europe to revive the ancient trading routes. Under this project, it is building a Silk Road economic belt, a land-based corridor comprising of roads and railway network to bring Asia closer to Europe, and it is also trying to revive the maritime Silk Route by connecting Asia with Africa, with Middle East and with Europe. This ambitious connectivity project of China has increased its economic and strategic influence. Western countries even allege that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy through this project. Their allegation is that China is deliberately pushing commercially unviable projects at strategic locations in smaller countries. China is known to provide very attractive, cheap and concessional loans to smaller countries to fund these commercially unviable projects. These projects are financially unviable to begin with. But China looks at the strategic location and funds these projects. The smaller countries get attracted by the loans, the investments they are giving, and they accept the funding. Eventually, the project will fail commercially. The small countries, they won't be able to repay the loan, and as a result, they fall into a debt burden. They fall into a debt trap of China. Eventually, China will force the small countries to hand over these projects for China for the long term. The best example for this would be the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. China has obtained a 99-year lease period for this strategic port. This port project failed commercially. It did not generate enough revenue for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka could not repay the debt, the loan it had borrowed from China. Eventually, it was forced to lease out Hambantota port to China for a 99-year lease period. So Western countries have alleged that China is pushing small countries into a debt burden through its One Belt, One Road project. So to counter that, the US has come out with an alternative proposal which is being referred to as the B3W, or Build Back Better World Partnership. Just like China, the US would lead this project, and it is looking to invest billions of dollars around the world to take up such infrastructure and connectivity projects. This was not the only decision of G7 which was directly targeted at China. In fact, they even made many direct references to China and its authoritarianism and its aggression. The G7 targeted China specifically for violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, especially freedom of expression, in several troubled regions of China. The G7 grouping criticized China's activities and China's policies in the Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur Muslim minorities have been reportedly targeted by the Chinese security agencies. In the name of de-radicalization and counter-terrorism, China reportedly is violating the human rights of innocent Uyghur civilians as well, and a lot of global attention has come to the Xinjiang province. Here China is accused of violating human rights. Then in Hong Kong, pro-democracy protesters, they have been targeted by the Chinese state, and several authoritative laws have been brought in place to erode democracy in Hong Kong. This is in direct contradiction to the basic law that governs Hong Kong. This was a commitment that China had made to Britain back in 1997 when Britain decolonized Hong Kong and gave independence to Hong Kong. Right? Hong Kong's sovereignty clearly lies with China, there's no doubt. But under the basic law and under this deal that China and Britain had entered into in 1997, a dual system had been implemented. That is, mainland China, as you know, is an authoritative state, it's a communist state. Whereas Hong Kong was kept separate, the political system in Hong Kong was different, it continued to remain a democratic state. But in the last 3-4 years, there have been many adverse developments through which China has eroded democracy in Hong Kong. The pro-democracy protesters, they have been targeted by the Chinese state and the security agencies. This again is termed as a violation of human rights and violation of basic democratic rights. The G7 has expressed concern about China's aggression against Taiwan and its aggression in the South China Sea against the ASEAN countries. Because here China has an active maritime dispute going on, right, with Southeast Asian countries. It has a dispute going on over the sovereignty of Taiwan as well, and here China is displaying a lot of military aggression. So G7 countries have given support to these countries and they have taken a stand against China. And even with regard to the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, the G7 had a lot of discussion because recently the lab leak theory is back in news. A lot of credible evidence is coming out to indicate that COVID-19 might be of lab origin. So this has led to a lot of speculation. Last year it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory, but now the US has taken it up very seriously and it has asked its intelligence community to investigate these allegations. So all these matters were discussed and they were specifically targeted at China, right? Next, another important development is that the G7 has proposed a possible expansion of this grouping. Most likely, India, Australia, South Africa and South Korea might be included and the group might be expanded in the future to become the D10 or the D11 or the G10 or the G11. This is just a proposal. US, UK and the other countries have backed this proposal. That is why they are inviting these other democratic countries as guest participants. In this year's summit, India, Australia, South Korea and South Africa, they were invited as guest participants. So there is a proposal to expand the G7 in the future and turn it into the D10. The D over here stands for democracy. That is what binds these countries. All these are functional liberal democracies, and there is a proposal by the G7 to expand the membership, bring all democratic countries together to oppose authoritarianism. Now this initiative of G7 is directly targeted against two authoritative states, that is Russia and China. This is where India gets caught in between, right? The G7 is looking to expand, US in particular and European countries, they are looking to form a club or an alliance of the democratic nations. They are looking at this as a grouping against authoritative states like Russia and China. So this brings a lot of benefits for India, plus it creates many challenges as well. So let's conclude today's discussion by talking about India's equation with this grouping. See, India has been invited several times to participate in the discussions of the G7 as a guest participant. When this grouping was the G8, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was invited 5 times to participate in the discussions. Now after it became the G7, Prime Minister Modi has been invited 2 times, one in 2019 when France invited India, and now in 2021 when UK invited India to participate as a guest country. So India has a history of participation at the G7. There is one big advantage for India at the G7. This is the ideological similarities that we share, right? India is a major economy today, a major economic power. We are a democratic nation. So obviously this ideological similarity brings us closer to the G7 countries. Be it the global economy, be it strategic issues and geopolitical issues. We all have many common concerns. So this brings India together with them. So this proposal of setting up a D10 or a D11 is very attractive for India. It gives India an opportunity to exert pressure on China and its aggression. As you know, China has been very aggressive against India as well in the border regions. With regard to our border conflict, China has become very aggressive, and India sees this as one of the platforms through which China could be cornered and global pressure could be exerted on China. Okay? Then apart from that, Prime Minister Modi took part in the summit virtually. He thanked the G7 members for helping India during the deadly second wave of the pandemic, because these countries, they all rushed assistance to India, right? So he expressed further support in containing the pandemic. He gave a call for adopting the One Earth, One Health approach so that the global community can deal with healthcare challenges as one single entity. Instead of being divided by national boundaries, Prime Minister Modi called upon G7 and the global community to work together to contain the pandemic and work together to procure vaccines and distribute and administer vaccines. So that's why the Indian Prime Minister appreciated the G7's decisions related to vaccine raw materials and the possible patent waiver at WTO trips. These decisions of the G7 has been appreciated by India, and India has even expressed support to counter rising authoritarianism and extremism in the world, right? So all these decisions, they put India in line with the objectives of the G7. Then finally, India also used the opportunity to bring up its ongoing conflict with social media firms and technology based companies. As you know, the new IT rules of India has led to a standoff between the Indian government and social media firms like Twitter, Facebook and WhatsApp. So the Indian Prime Minister brought up the issue over here. He called upon these companies which are based out of these developed countries to cooperate with the Indian government to create a safe cyber environment. He has asked these companies to cooperate with India, abide by the rules so that we can deal with the security challenges that are emerging on the online platforms. So in short, the G7 represents a very, very important platform for India. India is not a member of this grouping, but there is a possibility that the D10 could become a formal organization, right? So in conclusion, you should know that these two topics are very important for your exams. One is the overall evolution of G7 and what has been India's equation with the G7. That could be a potential mains question. There you should talk about the advantages that G7 offers for India. Talk about the economic concerns, the common economic objectives. the ideological similarities, the strategic similarities between India and the West. So all these advantages are in line with our national interests. At the same time, it gives us an opportunity to push for major global reforms, reforming the global financial system, reforming World Bank, reforming the global economy. We could even push for a digital services tax at the global level so that all the large tech-based companies are taxed and governments can benefit out of it. So such major economic reforms can be pushed by India through the G7 platform. It presents many advantages. At the same time, there are several drawbacks as well, because these developed countries, they are looking after their self-interests. In many cases, it may not be aligned with Indian interests. Now just look at how G7 is using the platform to target China. The US in particular is using the G7 to target China. Now the question is this in India's interest? Should India actively participate in a platform where one country is being singled out? Because traditionally we have followed a principle of independence and strategic autonomy in our foreign policy. We have always stayed away from any alliances or clubs which selectively target few countries, right? This has been India's foreign policy. So there are both sides of the argument to this. There are many experts who argue that India should side with G7 and US to contain China, because this is the best platform to exert pressure on China. There are others who are opposed to this policy. There are many strategic experts who point out the disadvantages, the pitfalls that exist. If India sides with G7 entirely, and if we align strategically with the US, we would be entering a strategic club, which we have never done in the past. Our foreign policy has always remained independent and autonomous, and we have never targeted any single country. Then moreover, China is an immediate neighbor of India. These countries, they don't share boundaries with China. India shares a boundary with China. So if tensions escalate, these countries are unlikely to come to India's assistance in case of any clashes or conflicts. So keeping all these aspects in mind, few experts point out that India should balance its relations between the West and China. But one thing is very clear, the G7 is becoming a platform where the rivalry between the West and China, and even between the West and Russia, is playing out. The question is, what choices will India make in the future, right? Will India side permanently with the West, or will we strike a balance? Will we balance our ties with the West and China and Russia? These are the questions that need to be answered, and you can expect such analytical questions in mains. Okay, so this concludes our discussion for today, and let's end our talk on G7. If you like these initiatives, please like the videos, comment on them, share these videos with your fellow aspirants, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.